Hello and welcome back to Parallax Scrolling for web design. So far we've got our text and our stars scrolling, so we've got a good start here, but now we need to start making the images start to scroll because we can't even see our images, and as far as we know they're not even there anymore. We've shoved them down past the bottom edge of the screen and we've set them inside a fixed position element, so when we scroll down we're never going to be able to see it because again it's fixed. So we're going to do the same thing we did with the stars, which were also fixed, and we're going to alter the top position of those images using jQuery. So we're going to jump back into our code. This is the code we ended with in the last video, and this will be saved when we're done in the lesson 12, or I'm sorry, the lesson 13 end. Right now we're looking at lesson 12, so let's go ahead and update this. And everything should look the same so far. But once we've added everything and saved everything, it will be saved again in the lesson 13 end folder. So in our code, we've created a line of code here to scroll our stars, and we're going to do the same thing for our images. All of our images are contained in a div with an ID of images. So we can just scroll that one images div instead of having to scroll each image separately. So what we're going to do is we're going to point to that images div. Again, it's a div element with an ID of images, and inside that div we've put all of our separate images that we're going to be pointing to here. So we're going to again change the CSS property of that. We're going to change the top property, and we're going to use the same calculation, 0 minus, and then inside parentheses, scroll position, and then we're going to multiply that by some number. Now remember that we've mentioned several times before that we want our images to scroll at half the speed of the text itself. Well, the natural speed would be scroll position times 1, which would simply be the same way of saying scroll position. Well, to run this at half the speed, we would set it to scroll position times 0.5, and that would run it at 50% of the regular scrolling speed, or 50% of the speed of the text as it's scrolling up and down. So then we'll move over just before the final parenthesis there and add our plus and then px inside single quotes, and then close your parentheses, close your end your line with a semicolon there, and that should do the trick. So again, since we're multiplying this by 0.5, the images here will scroll at half the speed of the text. So let's save that and give it a shot. So we'll come back over here, refresh our page, and start scrolling down. And we see, once we get to a certain point, the moon shows up. And then, sure enough, as we get towards the top of the screen, we see the text start to catch up with it. Now it catches up with it at the very top. So we need to do a few more things to get this to work properly, to nudge both of these down a little bit, but this is a really good start. Let's keep scrolling to make sure that our next items show up at the same time. So there's the rocket, and as we get towards the top, the text shows up, and then once it gets to the very top of the screen, the text and the top of the image are aligned. So again, we'll go down to the image of Saturn here. We'll keep scrolling until the text shows up. Now when the text shows up here, it stops because the bottom of the text is the bottom of the content, which means that's the bottom of our scrollable area. So we're going to need to put some more padding below the text or some margins or something like that in order to space it down a little bit more. But we see so far that it's working. And now we'll also see as we click on our buttons that our buttons work pretty well too. Now they're not animating yet, but they will take us to the right place. So the back home button takes us to the top. The moon button takes us to the point where the moon and the moon text are at the top. Space flight, that looks good too. And see the planets will scroll us all the way down to the bottom of the page. And then we can click back on back home to get us back up to the top. And that's just using these named anchors that we created in our nav section. So we created these links here and we pointed them to pound Earth, pound moon, pound rocket. And these names that we gave them here are the IDs of the section we want it to take us to. So again, pound Earth, we're looking for a div or an object with an ID of Earth, which is this first item here at the very top of the screen, that image of the Earth. The item with the ID of moon is the first article after the home article. So it's scrolling to where this article is at the top of the screen. So that's how that works. We're pointing to, or we're linking to an object on the current page with an ID of moon, or an ID of rocket, or an ID of Saturn, and that will scroll us to the right place on the page. Now later on we'll talk about how to animate that scroll in jQuery, but for now it's cool to know that those links already work really well. So before we make that scrolling animation work, I want to get everything looking a little bit better in our file, because again, once we scroll up to the point where the moon and the text are even, they're up at the very top of the screen, and they're kind of bumped up behind the navigation, and that's not exactly what we want. We want to be able to see both of these objects really clearly before they get all the way up to the top. Well, the easiest way to fix this problem, I don't want to adjust the positioning of these items. Instead, we're just going to put some top padding in each of these items, and by applying a little padding to the top of this article, it will push the text within the article down a little bit, and we'll do the same thing for the images themselves. We'll put some padding in the top of those images. So we'll jump back into our files, and I want to go to the CSS file now, and for our articles, we have our content articles here, and in addition to setting the width, I want to set padding top. So we're going to put padding inside the top of that element, and we're going to set that to 50 pixels. Then we're going to jump up to the images section, and for each of our images, we're going to do the same thing. But we're not going to add the padding to the div with the ID of images, because that's the entire div that takes up all of the, or that contains all of the images. Instead, we're going to point to each of the images within that images div. So the way we'll do that is we'll just skip a couple lines after the images rule and point to pound images space image. So we're going to point to all of the image tags within that div that has an ID of images. And we're going to give each of those images a padding top, again, of 50 pixels. So we'll save that, go back into our file, scroll up to the top, and then Command R to refresh. And now when we go to the moon section, it takes us to the top, but now we have some padding there so that we can see the text completely on the screen, and we can see the image completely on the screen without hiding behind the nav menu. So we can just click on each of these sections to make sure that it works. And obviously we still need some work on this last section, but the moon and the space flight are perfectly spaced. And we can also scroll up and down to get to those as well, which looks a lot cooler. But again, we need to put some more space after the bottom of the See the Planets section. So I'm going to come back over to our file here, and we're going to find the content area with the ID of Saturn. Now I'm adding it to the content area because remember, the content area is the one that's scrolling naturally. If we were to add some spacing below the image of Saturn, then that wouldn't work, because remember, this images section is fixed. The only thing that's moving it up and down is not the scrolling, but the jQuery. So even if we add more space below that image of Saturn, it's not going to allow us to be able to scroll up further. We need to do that to the content. So we're going to come down to the Saturn content area here, and we're just going to add some bottom padding to this particular item. So let's add padding hyphen bottom, and let's give it a value of, let's try 600 pixels. So we'll save that, jump back into our file and refresh, and now we can scroll down even further, which gives us more room to work with, and that looks really good. Now we could give it even more room than that if we'd like. We can come back down here and give it a value of maybe 800 pixels to give us a little more padding to work with, and we can scroll down even further now. And that looks good. So now if we were to click on the See the Planets link here, it would take us to the right point in the page. And there's still a little bit of scroll room at the bottom, not much, but enough to work with, and not so much that we're going to have a bunch of empty, ugly space at the bottom of our site. So again, we just want to click on all the buttons again to make sure that everything is aligned properly, and we see that it is. And then we'll also just scroll through again because it just looks really cool to do that, because we have, again, 3 different scroll speeds here, and it looks really good. So in the next video, we'll talk about how to animate that scrolling whenever we click on any of these menu items, so that scrolling will happen by default instead of just jumping to the next spot on the page. So with everything saved, we'll move on to the next video. Thank you for watching.